Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of candlelit palaces and freezing stone hallways, the kind of royal bedrooms where silk curtains hide whispers sharp enough to spark a literal war. Now, do me a favor, slide your headphones on and just lean back. Let your body relax, because you're going to want to feel every bit of this. Picture yourself walking through these massive halls, catching the scent of wood smoke, expensive perfume, and old school ambition hanging in the air. And somewhere in the shadows, a queen is quietly deciding who's actually making it to breakfast tomorrow. See, history class usually makes queens sound like these polite ladies sitting next to kings, looking a bit stressed about taxes. But the deeper you dig into their real stories, the crazier it gets. We're talking about rulers who were poisoning relatives, locking up rivals, and running entire nations, all while showing up to dinner wearing jewelry that's worth more than a modern-day city. And honestly, you probably wouldn't even survive the night. Not because the queens are out to get you specifically, but because the, sanitation back then would probably take you out before an assassin even got close. They say a medieval castle smelled like a lovely mix of wet dogs, stale smoke, cheap wine, and pure human terror. Truly, civilization was peaking back then. So, before you get too comfortable, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you actually vibe with what I'm doing here. And as you're drifting off tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. There's something strangely peaceful about watching people from totally different corners of the world slowly falling asleep together while listening to terrifying history. Humanity just connects in the weirdest ways. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe flip on a fan for some white noise, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. We're starting in the ancient world, where power wasn't just a king's game. That's the first big lie history tries to sell you. Behind those massive thrones and gold crowns, it was often the queens running the whole show, using influence, fear, pure brilliance, and sometimes straight up terror. Some ruled out in the open, others operated in whispers, behind heavy velvet curtains, while nervous advisors just pretended not to notice. The weirdest thing about royal courts is how calm they look. On the surface, you've got musicians playing soft melodies, servants gliding through polished halls with silver trays, nobles bowing politely. But underneath all that glamour, everyone is looking over their shoulder. A simple smile at dinner could be hiding a murder plot meant for sunrise. It's a pretty well-known fact that royal courts lived and breathed on spies, hiding in plain sight. A maid pouring wine could whisper a secret conversation to the queen before midnight. Even the musicians were informants. People would just tune them out and talk freely, totally forgetting they were right there. Just picture it. In a torchlit hallway, a servant catches one careless sentence and realizes an entire family might just disappear by tomorrow. Scholars still argue today about whether some of these queens actually deserved their terrifying reputations, or if male historians just hyped up the cruelty because powerful women freaked them out. That debate hangs over almost every ruler we're talking about tonight. History isn't usually written by calm, neutral observers. It's written by the exhausted survivors just trying to stay off the gallows. As you wander deeper into this world, you realize survival isn't about kindness. It's all about timing. Royal families don't work like normal ones. Brothers betray brothers. Mothers manipulate their kids. Weddings aren't celebrations, they're political traps. Love happens sometimes, sure, but ambition is always the first one to walk into the room. There's even this bizarre detail from medieval Europe. Some queens had these tiny dogs, specifically trained to sit on their feet and keep them warm during winter events. Imagine that. A little, sleepy dog, tucked inside your massive gown like a living slipper, while you're casually discussing a death sentence. Somehow, in every century, Humans manage to mix adorable cuteness with horrific violence. As you move through another hallway, the candlelight flickers. Outside, rain is tapping against the palace windows. Somewhere nearby, armored guards stand dead still for hours, just praying there's no coup attempt tonight. The tension never really goes away. See, a ruler can have all the gold and armies in the world, but sleep is hard to come by. When poison fits so easily into a wine glass, and in the royal circles, poisoning was basically a fashion statement. Unlike the movies, most historical poisonings weren't instant. They were slow, painful, and filled with pure dread. A paranoid queen might force her servants to taste every single dish first. Some royals even traveled with their own personal food testers at all times. Ancient Rome is a pretty messed up example of this. They say the Roman elite used silver cups because they believed silver would change color if it touched poison. Sadly, science doesn't really back that up, but fear doesn't wait for a lab report. Fear just sits next to you at dinner, watching you take every sip. Now, you're starting to see the bigger truth. Power changes people. It's rarely a sudden flip into becoming a villain. Instead, these courts teach rulers to distrust everyone. Every compliment could be a lie. Every marriage proposal, a hidden military alliance. Every child, a future rival. Over time, survival just hardens into cruelty. This shift is even more dangerous for queens, because they often ruled in systems designed to underestimate them. A king could just make a loud threat. A queen had to survive on strategy, persuasion, secrets, and cold, hard patience. The result is a different kind of power, quieter, more subtle, and sometimes way more terrifying. Look at the massive portraits on the walls. Those faces stare down with expressions you just can't read. Some queens look calm and beautiful, pans folded neatly against jewel-encrusted gowns. But then, years later, historians find the stories hidden beneath those polished images. Stories of torture chambers, disappearances, or mass executions. There's even a wild example where astrologers held all the cards. Rulers would literally call off wars just because of a star chart. Imagine an entire empire changing course because someone misread the planet Jupiter. Humanity really loves gambling with fate, leaving life and death decisions to exhausted people, staring at glowing dots. At 3 a.m., the deeper you go, the more you realize how lonely these queens actually were. Palaces look fancy, but they're basically gold-plated prisons. Every move is watched. Every friendship is political. Even your own kids might sell you out for the throne. And maybe that loneliness explains what comes next. Some queens became eccentric tyrants, others, master manipulators. Some became legends twisted by rumors and propaganda, and some, they actually left behind a trail of trauma that's impossible to ignore. Over the next few nights, we're going through burning cities, silent executions, forbidden affairs, and castles where the locals still refuse to go out after dark. Soon, you'll meet queens accused of bathing in blood, rulers blamed for massacres, and empresses who reshaped entire nations through pure fear. But first, the Nile River sits quiet in the moonlight, and somewhere inside a palace, smelling of incense and ambition, Cleopatra is already planning her next move. The Nile flows slow and steady under the moonlight, its dark water catching the flicker of torches from Cleopatra's palace walls. The warm night air is thick with the scent of incense, river reeds, and a hint of salt from the Mediterranean. Just past the palace gardens, merchants are still whispering down by the docks, while guards pace the marble courtyards, their bronze spears gleaming under the stars. And right at the center of it all stands Cleopatra. History remembers her as beautiful first, dangerous second, and way down at the bottom as brilliant, which to be honest says a lot less about her and a lot more about us. Ancient writers obsessed over her looks, but most scholars today believe her real weapon wasn't her face, it was her voice. Cleopatra was fluent in a dozen languages, which was insanely rare for a ruler back then, while other leaders hid behind translators. She was talking direct to diplomats, generals, and kings. Scholars still argue about whether Roman historians hyped up her charms just so their powerful men didn't look like idiots for falling under her spell. See, it's a lot easier to say, a sorceress bewitched our leaders than it is to admit, our greatest men got played at a political game. Ancient propaganda works a lot like a modern-day internet comment section, just with more robes. Now, we're heading deeper into Alexandria, where Egypt is balancing between unthinkable wealth and a total disaster. Rome is getting stronger every year. Alliances are shifting, and betrayal, well, betrayal travels faster than the ships. At a very young age, Cleopatra realized a brutal truth. Weakness is just an invitation for destruction. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty. A royal line descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. By the time she came along, her family had spent generations dealing with paranoia, assassinations, and some seriously uncomfortable marriage traditions. See, to keep the bloodline pure, the Ptolemies often married their own siblings. It sounds like a movie plot, but remember, these were real people, sitting at dinner, pretending everything was totally normal. Just imagine being at that banquet, trying your best not to ask any questions. Cleopatra eventually married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as part of the family tradition. On paper, they ruled together, but in reality, the palace quickly became a battlefield, hidden under polished marble floors and silk curtains. It's a well-known fact that Cleopatra was eventually forced to flee Alexandria after her brother's advisors staged a power grab. For a while, the future Queen of Egypt was basically a fugitive. Picture her now, traveling through the desert under a freezing blanket of stars. Her loyal followers are loading up camels. Campfires are flickering against the endless sand dunes, and the wind is slowly dusting the wooden wagons with grit. Somewhere in the dark, you know the spies are watching her every move. But Cleopatra doesn't just disappear. This is where one of the most famous stories in history begins. According to ancient accounts, she managed to sneak back into the city and into Julius Caesar's private room. Hidden inside a bedroll or a rolled-up carpet, historians still argue over the exact details, because ancient writers loved a good dramatic twist as much as modern filmmakers do. But the image sticks, because it perfectly captures her reputation. She wasn't just a queen, she was a survivor. You can almost see the exhausted servants, dragging heavy rolls of fabric through the palace hallways, while the Roman guards barely even glance at them. Then, suddenly, Cleopatra herself steps out, calm, calculated, and ready to gamble the entire future of Egypt on a single conversation. And somehow, it actually works. Caesar becomes both her political ally and her lover. Together, they crush her rivals, including her brother, Ptolemy XIII. They say he drowned while trying to escape a battle after falling into the Nile wearing full armor. It's a grim reminder that ancient military gear weighed about as much as a small horse. After Caesar's victory, Alexandria changes. The city starts glowing with this new kind of confidence. The markets are overflowing with spices, manuscripts, ivory carvings, and bright fabrics imported from distant kingdoms. Philosophers are arguing in the massive libraries, while ships from all over the known world crowd the harbors. But underneath all that prosperity, there's a constant, lingering fear. Because Cleopatra knows one thing: Rome doesn't share power, Rome consumes it. Every alliance comes with invisible chains attached. Picture yourself wandering through the palace rooms, under painted ceilings and gold-trimmed furniture, while the servants whisper about Roman politics. Assassinations in Rome send shockwaves all the way to Egypt, and when Julius Caesar is murdered in 44 BC, Cleopatra suddenly loses her biggest protector. The game just got a lot more dangerous. For most rulers, this would have been the beginning of the end, but for Cleopatra, it was just another calculated move. Soon, she forms an alliance with Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful generals. Their relationship becomes the stuff of legends. Almost instantly, massive banquets, grand ceremonies, all political moves carefully wrapped in the guise of love. Ancient writers talk about parties where pearls were dissolved in wine. Exotic animals entertained the guests, and entire rooms glowed with the light of scented oil lamps. There's even this weird historical detail where Cleopatra actually rigged a fishing trip for Antony. She had divers sneak down and hook fish onto his line just to make him look impressive. See, even powerful Roman generals enjoyed a fake win every now and then. Human ego, it's the one thing that survives every civilization. But behind the luxury and the spectacle, the tension is building. Rome starts painting Cleopatra as this dangerous foreign temptress, a threat to everything Roman. Octavian, the future Augustus, is a master of propaganda. He starts telling everyone she's cunning, seductive, and has this almost supernatural influence. And honestly, maybe some of that fear was justified. Because Cleopatra did something most Roman leaders couldn't stomach. She wasn't just standing next to powerful men like a trophy. She was negotiating empires as an equal. The mood in the palace turns stone cold. Messengers are constantly arriving. War prep is happening in the shadows. Ships are crowding the harbors. While blacksmiths are hammering out weapons deep into the night, picture yourself standing by the palace windows, looking out at the Alexandria coast, where torchlit warships are swaying slowly in the dark water. Somewhere out there, Octavian is coming. The coming conflict would decide the fate of Egypt. And like so many rulers caught in the grip of history, Cleopatra started walking that thin line between brilliance and desperation. The final blow came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's forces crushed the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Historians still argue today whether Cleopatra's retreat during the battle was a strategic necessity, a panic attack, or a plan that just went horribly wrong. Whatever the truth is, the result is total destruction. Alexandria finally falls. Inside the palace, the music is replaced by silence. The servants disappear. The treasury rooms are stripped bare. Roman soldiers walk through the same hallways that were once filled with luxury and confidence. The world Cleopatra spent years protecting is being taken from her, room by room. Then comes the ending that history never forgets. Ancient stories say Cleopatra died from the bite of a snake, though scholars still debate if it was a cobra, or just a more realistic case of poison. Either way, her death turned into a legend in an instant. Picture that final scene. In total silence, the heavy curtains barely moving in the warm Egyptian air, gold lamps flickering against the painted walls. Outside, the Nile keeps flowing, just like it always has, completely indifferent to the empires collapsing on its banks. And somewhere, far beyond the fading glory of Alexandria, inside cold, dark fortresses, even darker queens are waiting. Far away, from the warm winds of Cleopatra's Egypt, the air turns freezing in the forests of Eastern Europe. Here, the roads are narrow. The trees grow thick under grey skies, and the distant palace towers stand on top of the hills like jagged black teeth. Villagers hurry home before sunset, carrying bundles of wood and baskets of winter vegetables, because once night falls over these valleys, the stories start spreading faster than common sense. And almost every story leads back to one place. Castle Castile. You can see it now. Looming high above the countryside, its stone walls fading into the storm clouds, windows glowing faintly through the drifting fog. Crows circle the towers, while cold rain washes down the ancient battlements. Somewhere below, people are whispering prayers and bolting their doors shut before the light is completely gone. Inside that castle lives Countess Elisabeth Báthory. History remembers her as the Blood Countess, one of the most notorious noblewomen to ever live. According to the legend, she tortured and killed a terrifying number of young women, and they say she actually bathed in blood, just to keep her beauty forever. It's a story so horrific. It feels like it was literally designed to keep people awake at night, shivering around a campfire. And maybe, just maybe, parts of it are actually true. Scholars still argue today about whether Elisabeth Báthory was really a cold-blooded serial killer, or if she was just a victim of a political hit job, designed to destroy a wealthy, powerful widow. This debate has been going on for centuries. Some historians believe the charges were made up by rivals who wanted her land and her influence. Others point to witness statements that describe abuse so consistent it's impossible to ignore. The truth is buried somewhere in the dark, between myth and reality. Picture yourself now, moving toward the castle gates through muddy roads, surrounded by trees with no leaves left on them. The winter wind pushes against heavy cloaks, while the horses breathe out clouds of steam into the freezing air. Guards with lanterns watch silently from the entrance turrets. It's a well-known fact that Elizabeth was born in 1560 into Hungarian royalty, growing up surrounded by massive wealth, political power, and extreme violence. Her family was one of the most powerful noble houses in the region. This was an era where public executions were a form of entertainment. Wars wiped out entire villages, and cruelty was often hidden behind a noble title. People today sometimes think of history as being much cleaner and more civilized than it actually was. That is not true. Medieval Europe usually smelled like smoke, damp wool, horses, and untreated infections. On average, every castle had at least one hallway that could brew a disease that modern science hasn't even named yet. Elizabeth spent most of her youth in royal courts, where political marriages were basically business contracts wrapped in expensive fabric. She eventually married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a terrifying military commander known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Romantic, right? Ferenc was away for long periods, fighting Ottoman armies, which left Elizabeth to run the estates, the servants, the money, and everything else herself. And by most accounts, she was incredibly sharp and exceptionally well educated for her time. They say she spoke multiple languages and handled the business side of things like a pro. But slowly, the rumors started to leak out. In the beginning, the stories seemed small. A servant went missing. A girl returned home with bruises after working at the castle. Villagers started whispering about screams heard late at night, coming from the stone towers during storms. Picture yourself now, stepping carefully through the castle. The narrow hallways twist under low ceilings blackened by candle smoke. Servants hurry by with buckets of water and folded linens, avoiding eye contact at all costs. Iron keys jingle from their belts. The wooden doors creak slowly as the cold wind pushes through the cracks. There's a strange kind of fear that settles into wealthy homes. A bizarre historical detail is that Elizabeth would sometimes lash out at servants, punishing minor mistakes with terrifying rage. According to one story, when a maid accidentally pulled her hair while combing it, she reportedly snapped. Whether that story is exaggerated or true, these kinds of tales spread through the servants' quarters like wildfire. Because inside palaces, gossip isn't just talk, it's a survival instinct. You descend deep underground, where the torchlight flickers against damp stone walls. The storerooms smell of mold, wine barrels, and cold earth. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint rattle of iron chains. According to later testimonies, young maids who entered the castle would sometimes just vanish. Some accounts describe beatings, starvation, and sentences of death by exposure to the freezing cold. Other details are even more horrific, though historians stay cautious. See Many witness statements came out under some very messy political circumstances. Scholars still debate if those famous stories about the bathing in blood were just sensational propaganda cooked up after her arrest, added later just to ramp up the terror. There's actually very little evidence from that time to support the literal bloodbath story, but somehow that image is more powerful than anything else attached to her name. Humans really do love a terrifying symbol. Outside the castle, the brutal winters keep crushing the villages. Snow piles up against wooden shacks, while peasants struggle with famine, disease, and back-breaking labor. The nobles, they live in an entirely different world. Expensive fabrics, heated rooms, grand banquets. The gap between the elites and the peasants feels almost unreal. And maybe that's exactly how the cruelty thrives, unnoticed. Because in powerful families, servants often have zero protection. You walk through a massive hall now, where candles flicker near giant fireplaces, animal skins are draped over wooden benches, and hunting trophies line the walls. Elisabeth herself appears, sitting in a corner under deep shadows, wearing black velvet embroidered with silver thread, quiet, controlled, watching everything. This isn't some monster from a fairy tale, and that's exactly what makes these stories so unsettling. The real villains of history rarely look like villains. A major fact accepted by historians is that an investigation only started after the complaints and rumors became too loud to ignore. A Lutheran pastor named István Magyari reportedly called out these abuses in public, which finally forced the local authorities to take notice. But still, powerful nobles have a kind of protection that normal people can only dream of. It takes years for any real action to happen. And when it does, it's sudden. In 1610, Count György Thurzó, a high-ranking official, enters Castle Castile to investigate the claims. Later reports claimed that the investigators found imprisoned girls, injured servants, and even bodies hidden within the palace walls. The atmosphere shifts in a heartbeat. Imagine the silence inside those hallways, as armed men with lanterns move from room to room, kicking open locked doors. Servants are shivering against the walls. Outside, the snow is falling silently, while inside, generations of noble privilege start to crumble. Elisabeth herself never faced a public execution. Her status protected her from that kind of shame. Instead, she was reportedly placed under house arrest, right inside her own castle. According to the legend, parts of her rooms were literally sealed off, with only tiny gaps left for food and air. Picture her final years, in total silence. Cold stone walls, the dim flicker of a candle, the sound of footsteps, getting fainter with every passing season. A woman who was once surrounded by servants and power, now trapped inside her own fortress, while the winter winds howl through the mountains outside. And somewhere else in history, another queen is waiting patiently in imperial China, where silk robes hide ambitions, as sharp as a blade. Morning mist slowly settles over the royal palaces of ancient China, making the golden roofs and massive red walls look even more beautiful in the soft light. The courtyards stretch out in perfect symmetry, while servants carrying lacquered trays move silently through gardens filled with koi ponds, stone bridges, and plum trees heavy with blossoms. Somewhere nearby, you hear the soft ring of distant bells. Everything feels so peaceful. You'd almost believe there's no room for anger here. That illusion usually lasts about 3 minutes. Because behind these grand walls, Wu Zetian is waiting. She is the only woman in thousands of years of Chinese imperial history to officially rule as emperor in her own name. Not a queen consort standing next to a king. Not a queen mother whispering from the shadows, the emperor. And according to her enemies, she was absolutely terrifying. Picture yourself now, walking through the Tang Dynasty court, where appearances matter almost as much as power. Silk robes shimmer in saffron, emerald, and deep crimson, and the ceilings are decorated with dragons and clouds. Officials bow with perfect precision, while court musicians play soft melodies on stringed instruments. But behind all this beauty, there's a relentless competition. Every smile hides a calculated strategy. Every bow is a test of status. And every single conversation carries the risk of becoming a political weapon. A major historical fact accepted by scholars is this. Zetian didn't start her journey as a ruler in the 7th century. She was just a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong. In the beginning, in that massive royal court, she seemed relatively unimportant. But royal courts are like the ocean. Calm waters often hide dangerous creatures underneath. After Taizong died, tradition said that childless concubines had to retire permanently to Buddhist monasteries. Wu actually went to one for a short time. Most people probably assumed her political story was over right then and there. But they were wrong. Because fate, ambition, and palace secrets combined to create something much more dangerous. Taizong's son and successor, Emperor Gaozong, became obsessed with Wu Zetian and eventually brought her back to the court. This caused an instant scandal. Ancient Chinese court politics were already like a chessboard designed by skeptical philosophers. Bringing your father's former concubine back into the palace? That just turned the chaos up to 10. And Wu handled that chaos like a pro. Picture yourself now, going deep into the royal residence, where incense smoke slowly drifts through private rooms, decorated with jade carvings and silk embroidery. Maids are whispering behind their hands, while eunuchs carry sealed messages through the hallways. A bizarre detail of Tang court life shows just how exhausting palace life really was. Officials would sometimes spend hours, literally hours, memorizing exact formal movements just to approach the emperor correctly. Just imagine risking a political disaster just because you bowed at the wrong angle. Human civilization really does love its complicated and stressful rituals. Wu Zetian kept climbing higher in the court, and soon, the rumors about her rise started to spread like a fever. Rivals started to disappear. Accusations were whispered in every corner, and then, the most infamous story of her ascent came to light. The sudden death of her newborn daughter. According to accounts written later by her enemies, Wu blamed Empress Wang for the child's death, claiming that jealousy drove her rival to commit the act. This accusation shook the royal court to its core. Empress Wang was stripped of her power, and eventually, Wu herself became the new empress. But the story gets even darker. Some historians claim that Wu might have actually ended her own child's life just to frame her rival and clear her path to the throne. Scholars are still locked in a heated debate over this. Was it the truth, or was it just misogynistic propaganda created by later Confucian historians who were terrified of a woman in power? There's no smoking gun, no real proof, but the story survives because it perfectly reinforces the image of a woman who was willing to sacrifice anything for total control, even her own blood. Now look at yourself, walking through palace hallways lit by golden lanterns where guards in polished armor stand perfectly still next to carved wooden doors. Outside, the rain is tapping softly against the tiled roofs. Inside the royal court, the fear is slowly starting to rise. Inside the royal court, the fear is slowly starting to rise. Wu Zetian is proving to be incredibly effective at locking down her power. She studies the system, builds alliances, rewards her loyalists, and removes her enemies with surgical precision. Ancient records describe a massive network of secret police operating under her command. Informants are everywhere, throughout the entire government. Officials are suspicious of their servants, their co-workers, and even their own families. And let's be real, When public executions become a regular topic of conversation, that suspicion is pretty much justified. One historical fact is clear. Wu massively expanded the imperial exams. This gave talented commoners more opportunities in the government, instead of just relying on noble bloodlines. It's ironic that so many capable leaders benefited from reforms started by a ruler who was later remembered mostly for her cruelty. History is full of these uncomfortable contradictions. Imagine the exam halls now, packed with nervous scholars hunched over scrolls for endless hours while guards patrol silently nearby. Their entire future depends on beautiful handwriting and philosophical essays. Meanwhile, somewhere above it all, Wu is building an empire through strategies that are faster and sharper than any generals. But the accusations keep piling up. Political rivals reportedly face torture, forced confessions, exile, or death. Noble families linked to the opposition are suddenly shattered. Navigating the royal court is getting more dangerous every single day. One wrong alliance can wipe out generations of reputation overnight. You walk through the palace gardens at dusk, where koi fish swim under dark water lilies, and paper lanterns sway slowly in the cool evening air. Even here, the peace feels fake, too controlled, too careful. Finally, Wu took the ultimate step. After the emperor died, and after years of ruling through weak successors, she officially declared herself emperor in 690 AD, starting her very own Zhou dynasty. This moment, it absolutely trashed traditional Confucian society. For centuries, royal power had been a strictly male-dominated game. Wu didn't just break the rules, she set them on fire. And that's probably why future historians would never have a nice thing to say about her. One bizarre detail is that she actually ordered officials to create brand new Chinese characters to celebrate her reign, including unique symbols that represented her power. Imagine thinking ordinary titles weren't enough. So you literally re-engineered the language. That level of confidence was either pure brilliance or the start of total chaos. Probably both. As the years went by, Wu grew older, but she stayed politically untouchable. Buddhist influence exploded during her reign. Massive statues and religious projects were built to back up her right to rule. Some supporters truly admired her intelligence, others, well, they just lived in fear of being next on her list. Scholars still argue today if Wu's reputation was unfairly trashed compared to male emperors, whose violence is usually just called good management. Almost every ancient ruler ended their rivals. That was just the job. But for some reason, history likes to add an extra layer of shame when a woman does it. Still, even her fans wouldn't call her kind. Picture the palace mood getting even heavier now. Aging officials are moving carefully through endless ceremonies, while rival groups are quietly prepping for the inevitable fight for the throne. Behind those silk curtains, the whispers are getting loud again. Eventually, illness breaks Wu Zetian's grip on power. Her enemies get their confidence back. In 705 AD, just before her death, officials forced her to step down. And right after, history started rewriting her story. Some accounts paint her as a brilliant reformer. Others describe her as a cold-blooded tyrant soaked in ambition. In reality, she was probably far more human and far more complicated than either version. You leave the royal palace now, under a falling evening snow, as the soft ring of bells echoes through the courtyards. But a much darker fire is burning somewhere else, because across the sea in England, another queen is waiting, surrounded by rising smoke and public executions, while terrified citizens whisper a new name in history: Bloody Mary. Cold rain is pouring down on London, turning the narrow streets into rivers of mud under a grey sky. Church bells echo across the city, while merchants pull canvas covers tight over stalls filled with fish, onions, wool, and damp wood. Smoke rises from crowded chimneys, mixing with the smell of horses, whetstone, And something sharper, hidden underneath it all. Fear. You're walking slowly through the alleys now, watching citizens talk in low voices, while royal guards patrol nearby with spears and lanterns. Every conversation in every tavern feels guarded. Every sermon in every church feels more intense than ever before, because Queen Mary I is sitting on the throne of England, and history remembers her by a name that no ruler actually wants. Bloody Mary. The strange thing is, Mary's story doesn't start with crosse, ult. It starts with rejection. Long before her reign was defined by public execute.ins and religious terror, she grew up as a royal daughter trapped in one of England's most chaotic families. Her father is Henry VIII, a king whose romantic decision-making style is basically like using dynamite to solve a household argument. A major historical fact sits at the center of Mary's life. Henry VIII broke England away from the Catholic Church after the Pope refused to cancel his marriage to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. That one decision changed English history forever, and it absolutely destroyed Mary's childhood. Picture the young princess walking through the palace hallways now, and suddenly, all her security is gone. Servants who used to bow with respect have changed. Her mother has been pushed out of the picture politically, and Mary herself, she loses her status and her legitimacy in the eyes of the court overnight. Royal children rarely have control over their own lives. They're basically just pawns in the hands of adults who are obsessed with power. And these early insults, they leave deep scars. Scholars still argue today whether the religious persecution Mary started later came from genuine belief or from years of emotional trauma, political insecurity, and isolation in her father's unstable court. Honestly, it was probably a toxic mix of all of it. You're moving deeper into Tudor England now, where massive stone palaces stand right next to filthy streets, packed with butchers, beggars, and stray dogs. Noble women wear velvet gowns in deep reds and blues, while common workers struggle through the freezing rain in rough wool cloaks. The contrast feels brutal. Mary spent years in political limbo during her father Henry's reign, and later, under her half-brother Edward. Edward's Protestant advisors pushed England even further away from Catholic traditions. Churches changed fast. Ancient rituals just vanished. The Latin prayers people had known for generations were suddenly gone from the service. For many normal people, these changes were incredibly upsetting. In this era, religion touched every single part of life: birth, marriage, death, crops, disease, war. Everything was spiritually connected. People today sometimes underestimate just how terrifying religious uncertainty was in the 16th century. Imagine truly believing that your nation's spiritual decisions could send millions of souls to eternal hell. Suddenly, politics gets a lot more intense. When Edward VI died young in 1553, a succession crisis exploded almost immediately. Political groups tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary, but support for Mary, from both the nobles and the common people, grew like wildfire. And suddenly, after years of being an outsider, Mary becomes queen. London is filled with celebrations. Church bells ring out loud, bonfires light up the night. Crowds cheer as Mary enters the city under flags waving in the wind. After so many years of chaos, many people hope that stability is finally back. That optimism doesn't last long. Picture yourself now, walking through grand royal chambers where Mary kneels in prayer under flickering candlelight and a massive crucifix. Religious devotion defines almost every part of who she is. Unlike some rulers who use faith just for political gain, Mary seems completely committed to bringing Catholicism back to England. And honesty, combined with absolute power, can turn scary very fast. A bizarre detail of Tudor court life highlights the deep suspicion surrounding the crown. Royal food tasters are constantly checking every meal for poison. While servants memorize complex protocols that decide who can even speak to the Queen, one wrong move can ruin a career in a heartbeat. Meanwhile, England is heading straight toward the darkness. In 1554, Mary married Philip of Spain, and it sent a wave of massive anxiety through the public. Many English citizens were terrified of foreign influence taking over. Rebellions broke out. Protestant resistance started spreading quietly through towns and villages. Mary's response was brutal. A major historical fact defines her reign forever. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were condemned to death. Many of them publicly burned at the stake. Men, women, the elderly, and sometimes even teenagers. These executions became symbols of warning. Picture yourself now, standing in a crowded public square under black clouds, where terrified citizens gather around wooden pillars, piled high with logs. Priests are praying. Guards are keeping the restless crowd back. Somewhere nearby, church bells ring slowly, and smoke rises into the cold air. Even imagining it is deeply unsettling. Burning people in public wasn't just about punishment, it was about terror. Authorities believed that seeing the suffering would discourage religious disagreement. Instead, many of these deaths created Protestant martyrs, whose stories spread across England with an intense emotional power. One especially famous figure was Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. They say before his end, Cranmer actually thrust the hand he used to sign a forced confession directly into the fire first, saying it deserved to burn. Moments like that stay burned into the public memory, and eventually, that memory becomes Mary's biggest enemy. Scholars still debate if Mary understood how much these executions trashed her reputation with the common people. Some historians think she genuinely saw the persecution as spiritual rescue, believing harsh punishment could save souls from eternal hell. Others argue that political fear and insecurity were driving her decisions. Either way, England just kept getting darker. You're walking through jail cells now, where accused heretics wait for questioning under damp stone ceilings and narrow barred windows. Outside, the London rain is constant, while rumours spread from tavern to tavern faster than any official announcement. A bizarre historical detail from that era feels almost absurd next to all this violence. Wealthy Tudor nobles sometimes carried tiny perfume boxes filled with scented herbs. Because the smell of the cities was so horrific, they believed the scent protected them from disease. Imagine holding a small gold ball of lavender to your face during a public execution, just to avoid breathing in the reality of medieval London. Human survival instincts are strangely creative. As time goes on, Mary's isolation grows. False pregnancies devastated her emotionally and politically. She desperately wanted an heir to secure a Catholic future for England. But no heir ever came. Philip stayed abroad for long periods. Public support just kept fading away. And maybe the worst part is, her methods failed. England did not permanently return to Catholicism. Instead, the killings helped solidify a Protestant identity across the country. Later, writers turned Mary into the ultimate symbol of religious cruelty, especially in John Foxe's famous book of Martyrs. The Bloody Mary nickname stuck for centuries. Picture her final days now, flickering candlelight on the palace walls, the soft tap of rain on the windows, advisors whispering nearby, while illness slowly drains the strength from a queen who was once welcomed by cheering crowds. Mary died in 1558, exhausted and deeply unpopular, and almost immediately, England shifts again under her half-sister, Elisabeth I. But across the English Channel, another royal court is already waiting, in a world of candlelit ceilings and suspicion, where Catherine de' Medici is quietly watching France drift toward a massacre. The scent of France is completely different from England. Here, the air smells like wine, river water, perfume, roasted chestnuts, and sometimes the sharp, metallic tang of panic on the crowded streets of Paris. Church bells echo through narrow alleys, while royal carriages rattle over muddy roads, past merchants selling velvet, candles, and warm bread under striped awnings. And behind the grand style of the French court stands Catherine de' Medici, watching everything with a patience that only comes from someone who survives by being invisible. Until it's way too late. History is rarely kind to her. Depending on who's telling the story, Catherine is either a brilliant political warrior trapped in an impossible situation, or a cold-blooded mastermind whose name is forever linked to one of the bloodiest massacres in French history. Naturally, people saw a collapsing kingdom full of armed religious extremists, and decided one woman must be secretly controlling it all. Civilizations are really good at oversimplifying disasters. You're entering the royal court now, where silk gowns sweep across marble floors under chandeliers glowing with candlelight. Nobles sparkle in pearls and embroidered velvet, while musicians play soft melodies near massive fireplaces. But behind all this beauty, France is shaking, because the country is literally tearing itself apart over religion. A major historical fact shapes almost every moment of Catherine's life. 16th century France is locked in a violent war between Catholics and Protestants, known as the Huguenots. Entire cities are breaking down, both politically and spiritually. Neighbors stop trusting each other. Noble families start building private armies. And massacres start happening out of nowhere. And for years, Catherine is trapped right in the center of all that chaos. She was born into the powerful Medici family of Florence, growing up surrounded by politics, massive wealth, and constant danger. The Medici name was already linked to banking, power, and cold-blooded survival. As a young woman, Catherine married Henry, who later became King Henry II of France. But in the beginning, she really struggled in the royal court. Her husband openly favoured his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, whose influence over Henry was common knowledge. Imagine living for years as the queen, while another woman controls the king's attention, his political moves, and his heart. Royal marriages are basically just incredibly expensive hostage situations. But Catherine waited, and that patience became her ultimate weapon. Picture yourself now, walking through the Louvre Palace, long before it was ever a museum. The hallways are lit by torches, reflecting off painted ceilings and stands of polished armor. Servants hurry by with silver trays of figs, roasted pheasant, and wine, while nobles whisper behind sleeves made of expensive lace. Every single conversation here feels dangerous. Then, suddenly, fate flipped the script. In 1559, King Henry II suffered a horrific jousting accident when a lance shattered and went straight through his eye. Despite every attempt by doctors to save him, the king died a painful death after days of agony. Scholars still argue whether this trauma is what led Catherine to take astrology and prophecy so seriously later on. Some accounts claim that Nostradamus himself warned her about the dangers of that tournament years before, though historians stay cautious about such dramatic stories. Still, that atmosphere of prediction and fear stayed locked to Catherine's image. After Henry was gone, Catherine took over the real political power as regent for her young sons, who sat on the throne one after another, while they were still too inexperienced, or too weak, to actually rule. And right then, France started to fall apart. Religious violence is spreading everywhere. Protestant and Catholic groups are constantly fighting to control the crown. Murders, riots, conspiracies, and betrayals have basically become part of daily life. You're walking through the crowded streets of Paris now, where angry sermons echo from the churches, while armed men gather nervously outside taverns. Posters accusing rivals of heresy appear on the walls overnight, Families hide their religious beliefs, even from their own neighbours. The entire kingdom feels like dry wood, just waiting for a spark. Catherine sometimes tries to balance the different groups, negotiating temporary peace deals and setting up political marriages to lower the tension, but the distrust is just too deep. A bizarre detail of the French court feels almost unreal. Next to all the rising violence, they say nobles wore gloves scented with amber, musk, and citrus, because Renaissance cities smelled horrific. Imagine sitting at dinner, dramatically waving a perfumed glove while discussing the details of a civil war. Humanity really does stay dedicated to aesthetics, even during a collapse. But even darker accusations keep circling Catherine. Rumours started to leak out that she used poison against her enemies. Stories described secret labs, toxic perfumes, poisoned books, and even specially treated gloves designed to slowly end a victim's life. Historians argue how much of this is true and how much was just anti-Medici propaganda, fueled by a hatred of foreigners and a fear of powerful women. There's actually very little hard evidence linking Catherine directly to these complex poisoning plots. But those rumours survived because they fit her image perfectly. Elegant, intelligent, dangerous. And then, the event happened that stained her legacy forever. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. You can already feel the tension in the air. In 1572, Paris was prepping for a massive royal wedding between the Protestant Henry of Navarre and Catherine's daughter, Margaret. Officially, this wedding was supposed to bring peace between Catholics and Protestants. But instead, thousands of Huguenots poured into a city that was already boiling with suspicion. At first, the celebrations looked promising. Bells were ringing. Noble guests arrived in blue, red, and gold. The palace halls were buzzing with music and laughter. Then, the violence exploded. One major historical fact is undeniable. Starting on August 24th and lasting for weeks across France, thousands of Protestants were murdered in waves of massacres. The streets turned into a scene of pure terror. You're moving through the narrow alleys of Paris now, under a smoke-filled sky, while terrified families bolt their wooden doors shut. Church bells are ringing wildly. Armed mobs with torches and blades surge through the darkness. Bodies fall into the River Seine, while nobles, who were once welcomed as guests, are suddenly running for their lives. And one question dominates every historical debate. How much of this was Catherine de' Medici's fault? Scholars are still locked in a heated argument over whether Catherine just wanted a few targeted hits on Protestant leaders that spiraled out of control, or if she actually backed a full-scale massacre from the start. There's evidence she was terrified of the Huguenots having too much influence over her son, King Charles IX. There's also evidence she supported aggressive moves against certain Protestant leaders, but the exact scale of her intent? It's still a mystery. History rarely gives clear answers, only consequences. Picture Catherine walking through candlelit palace rooms during those horrific nights, while screams echo from far beyond the walls. Advisors are sprinting through the hallways with messages. Guards are slamming doors shut. Somewhere outside, Paris is burning with a religious hatred that has completely taken over the streets. And maybe, Catherine herself realized that things were spinning out of control. A bizarre detail from witness accounts says that the number of bodies floating in the River Seine got so high that citizens temporarily avoided certain parts of the river altogether. When a mob starts to feel justified in their violence, human cruelty accelerates at a terrifying speed. This massacre trashed France's reputation across Europe. Protestant nations were stunned. Radical Catholics celebrated. The trust between religious communities was shattered. Meanwhile, Catherine survived. She stayed politically alive for years in a kingdom that was constantly bleeding. Maybe that's the strangest part of her story. Not the dramatic villainy, but the survival. Because, while kings grow weak and factions fall apart, Catherine outlasts almost everyone around her. You're leaving Paris now under that smoke-filled sky as the church bells fade into the night air. But far across the ocean, another ruler is waiting on a remote island where executions have become so common that citizens only feel safe in total silence. Her name is Ranavalona, and Madagascar is about to get very quiet. Thick mist hangs over the jungles of Madagascar, while the soft beat of drums echoes from the distant hills. Morning sunlight filters through dense trees filled with orchids, towering ferns, and strange birds whose cries sound almost human in the heavy air. Red mud roads wind through villages of wooden houses with steep thatched roofs, where light smoke rises from cooking fires and children carry clay pots toward nearby streams. At first glance, this island looks incredibly beautiful. Then, you start to hear the stories. Here, the whispers are everywhere. Villagers lower their voices when they say certain names, glancing toward the royal roads as if fear itself is listening nearby. Traders coming from remote settlements spread rumors at the edges of crowded markets, surrounded by woven baskets, bags of rice, dried fish, and bundles of sugarcane. And eventually, every conversation leads back to the same ruler, Queen Ranavalona I. History remembers her as the Mad Queen of Madagascar. Though, like many terrifying rulers, the reality is way more complicated than a nickname. Some see her as a cruel dictator, responsible for massive suffering and loss of life. Others argue that she fiercely protected her kingdom from foreign takeover. At a time when European empires were seizing huge parts of the world, scholars still debate whether Ranavalona's isolation policies saved Madagascar's independence or destroyed the population to a point where it could never recover. Maybe both are true. Human history rarely gives us answers clearer than that. You're traveling now toward the royal capital of Antananarivo, high in the island's central highlands. Stone steps climb up between terraces and royal compounds. Looking out over massive green valleys, soldiers with spears patrol carefully, while nobles wearing beautifully woven lamba robes pass through crowded courtyards under a bright tropical sky. A major historical fact makes Ranavalona's rise clear immediately. At first, nobody expected her to rule. Born around 1778, Ranavalona's life started far away from the throne, but through marriage and palace politics, she linked herself to King Radama I, and her position inside the royal court slowly grew stronger. Then, in 1828, Radama's sudden death changed everything. Officially, the throne was supposed to go to someone else, but instead, Ranavalona moves fast. Her allies in the military and the political elite back her claim. Rival heirs disappear. Potential opponents are dealt with before they can even get organized. And suddenly, against all odds, Ranavalona becomes queen. Picture the coronation now, under the blazing sun. Drums echo across the crowded ceremony grounds. Warriors wave their spears in the air. Nobles kneel before a ruler that many never imagined would lead this kingdom. From the very beginning, Ranavalona rules through her authority and through fear. During this time, European influence is exploding across Africa and Asia. Missionaries bring Bibles, schools, foreign customs, and political connections. European traders push for special deals and influence over local rulers. Ranavalona sees danger in this expansion everywhere. And to be honest, she wasn't exactly wrong, because history shows over and over that colonial powers enter foreign lands politely at first, but they usually end up bringing the cannons and the flags. Because of the rising danger, Ranavalona reacts with total aggression. Foreign influence is cut off. Missionaries are watched with constant suspicion. People who convert to Christianity face brutal punishment. Trade becomes tight. And the government's grip on the island gets even stronger. A bizarre historical fact shows just how deep royal customs reached into daily life. Some ceremonies required strict symbolic actions, with sacred animals, formal robes, and carefully planned processions linked to ancestor worship. To outsiders, these rituals looked mysterious, but inside the kingdom, they were a constant reminder of who held the power. And Ranavalona, she understands symbols very well. You're walking through the royal compound now, where wooden palaces sit on carved stone foundations, and guards stand perfectly still under red flags. Servants hurry past with woven mats, clay bowls, and water jars, while royal advisors whisper anxiously at the edges of shaded courtyards. Even in the silence, the atmosphere feels strained, because under Ranavalona, punishment can come out of nowhere. One of the most infamous practices linked to her reign is the Tangina ordeal. In this judicial test, accused people were forced to eat poison taken from the Tangina fruit, along with pieces of chicken skin. If the person successfully vomited all 3 pieces, they were considered innocent. If they failed, they were proven guilty. And usually, that was the end. This means your legal defense strategy basically becomes surviving the poison. Medieval justice systems really were determined to invent new nightmares every single morning. A major historical fact is widely accepted. Massive numbers of people died during the Tangina tests under Ranavalona's rule. The exact numbers are still debated, but the horror is clear. Entire communities lived in fear of accusations because the trial itself was potentially fatal, whether you were innocent or not. Picture the villagers gathered under a sky heavy with clouds, watching nervously as royal officials prepare a poison mixture in carved wooden bowls. Families wait in silence nearby. Chickens scratch at the dirt. Somewhere in the distance, there's the low beat of a drum, and life just carries on in the middle of the terror. Over time, fear becomes normal. A normal fear. It changes entire societies. Ranavalona also started massive building and military projects, using thousands of her subjects for forced labor, roads, fortresses, royal buildings. The demands for physical work were devastating, especially in that brutal terrain and tropical heat. According to some estimates, the population of Madagascar dropped massively during her reign due to executions, forced labor, famine, disease, and isolation. Historians argue over the exact numbers, but the suffering, it was everywhere. But, despite the cruelty, Ranavalona kept her independence. Throughout her reign, European powers struggled to get a direct grip on Madagascar. Missionaries who were kicked out wrote about her with pure outrage and fear. European newspapers painted her like a villain from a gothic horror story. And maybe that image served imperial interests too, because independent rulers who resist European influence, they're rarely painted as the good guys in colonial history books. But resistance alone doesn't erase the cruelty. You're walking through a crowded public square now, where prisoners kneel under armed guards while people avoid making eye contact. The nearby markets go on peacefully, because even during political terror, people still need rice, tools, and clothes. It might be one of the strangest truths in history. Life just keeps going, right in the middle of the nightmare. A bizarre detail of the Madagascar court feels strangely peaceful compared to everything else. The nobles often wear beautifully woven silk lamba robes, dyed with rich natural colors and intricate patterns. Even a cruel state produces art, music, and craftsmanship. Humanity stays complicated until the very end. Scholars still debate. Did Ranavalona truly believe her harsh rule was saving Madagascar from foreign destruction, or did her mind slowly break under the weight of fear? The isolation gets deeper, the suspicion grows, the punishments get even more intense. The longer a ruler stays in absolute power, the more enemies they start to see, everywhere. You're entering the final years of her reign now. The royal palace feels a bit quieter. Aging advisors move carefully through the shaded hallways. Foreign visitors are rare. Stories of executions spread much further than official announcements. Outside the capital, the jungles sway in the tropical rain, while remote villages stay locked under her iron grip. Ranavalona ruled for over 3 decades, 33 years, long enough for fear to become tradition. She finally died in 1861, leaving behind a kingdom that was exhausted, but still independent. Her son immediately reversed her isolation policies and opened Madagascar to foreign influence almost overnight. And before the smoke from her funeral even cleared, history started debating her legacy. Tyrant, protector, monster, patriot, maybe she was all of them at once. You're leaving the island now, through the warm rain and distant thunder, while waves crash against the rocky shores of Madagascar. But somewhere else, in another royal court, silk curtains are swaying around a woman who is smiling softly while her rivals disappear. One by one, Empress Dowager Cixi is waiting. The Forbidden City wakes up slowly in the pale winter sunlight. A thin layer of frost sits on the golden roofs, while servants sweep stone courtyards with bamboo brooms under massive red walls. Their movements are careful and silent. Thin streams of incense smoke rise into the cold Beijing air, and somewhere inside the palace complex, bronze bells ring with a slow, formal precision. Everything looks orderly, controlled, almost peaceful. And that is exactly how powerful courts like to look. Right before someone mysteriously disappears. You're walking through endless palace hallways now, decorated with carved lacquer panels and silk curtains showing cranes, mountains, and flower branches. Eunuchs quietly carry sealed messages, while officials kneel in deep blue and saffron robes under hanging lanterns. At the center of this massive royal machine, Empress Dowager Cixi is waiting. History remembers her as one of China's most controversial rulers. To some, she's the mastermind who weakened the Qing dynasty through corruption and ego, while foreign powers tore the empire apart around her. To others, she's a political survivor, a woman who faced impossible crises in a collapsing royal system, created by men who underestimated her. Scholars still debate. Did Cixi delay China's modernization because she was too stubborn, or did later reformers unfairly blame her for problems that were destroying the empire long before she took power? And honestly, when historians can't agree if someone saved an empire or ruined it, you know the story is going to be complicated. The story begins in the mid-19th century, at the edges of the royal court, where the Qing dynasty is already under massive pressure. Foreign powers are demanding trade deals. Internal rebellions are exploding across the countryside. Corruption is rotting the government from the inside out, and opium addiction is spreading through society like smoke. A major historical fact shapes Cixi's rise. She entered the royal palace as a low-ranking concubine for the Xianfeng emperor. Like countless women before her, she arrived into a world of strict rules, endless ceremonies, and brutal competition for influence. Even before the politics start, life in the royal palace feels exhausting. Concubines memorize rituals, avoid offending superiors, and constantly build alliances. One wrong word could ruin years of careful strategy. Every servant is a potential spy, carrying gossip from one room to the next by nightfall. And Cixi, she turns out to be exceptionally skilled. She gives birth to a son, which immediately skyrockets her political importance. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, her young son became the Tongzhi emperor. This meant that, suddenly, unexpectedly, Cixi was closer to power than anyone ever imagined. You're entering those dimly lit palace rooms now, where mourning banners hang near flickering candles after the emperor's death. Officials are bowed low, while factions quietly plot their next moves. Behind silk curtains, the fight for political survival begins instantly. Because a regency, it creates dangerous opportunities. Several powerful ministers tried to take control of the government while the young emperor was still too small to rule. But Cixi cleverly allied herself with Prince Gong and other political heavyweights, pulling off what historians later called the Xingyu coup. The result? Her rivals lost power almost overnight. Some were executed, others were imprisoned, and Cixi emerged as the co-ruler, effectively leading China from behind the throne. A bizarre detail of life in the Qing court shows just how intense the control really was. Palace officials sometimes communicated through complex symbolic gestures and carefully written documents, because speaking directly carried the risk of insult or political disaster. An entire career depended on being able to express criticism so politely that it didn't trigger royal anger. Humanity invented bureaucracy and immediately turned grammar into a weapon. You're walking through the throne rooms now, where dragon motifs are carved in gold and red patterns on almost every surface. Eunuchs kneel near carved jade screens, while royal decrees pass through endless hallways in boxes decorated with lacquer. And everywhere, Cixi is watching. A historical fact widely accepted by scholars is that she ruled China through child emperors for decades. Even though she was never officially the emperor, her influence over royal policy was massive. Power from behind the curtain, literally. According to court protocol, during official meetings, she was often hidden behind silk screens while male officials formally addressed the child emperor. But everyone understood who was actually controlling the decisions. And maybe that indirect power is what makes later historians so uncomfortable. Because societies often tolerate ruthless male rulers more easily than women who master political systems designed to keep them out. Yet, Cixi's reign was hit by one disaster after another. The Taiping Rebellion devastated huge parts of China, leading to massive loss of life. Foreign armies invaded during the Second Opium War. Western powers forced humiliating treaties on the Qing government. Later, Japan decisively defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. The empire was fading fast. You're moving through the crowded streets of Beijing now, where merchants sell tea, silk, medicinal herbs, and paper lanterns under a hazy sky. Exhausted workers pull carts through muddy roads, while common people live through the royal crisis. History rarely stops the suffering easily. But inside the Forbidden City, suspicion is getting deeper. Officials are constantly accusing each other of corruption or disloyalty. Reformers push for modernization, while conservatives resist foreign influence. Cixi balances these groups carefully, sometimes supporting change, and sometimes crushing it depending on the situation. A major controversial moment comes during the 100 Days of Reform in 1898. The young Guangxu emperor tries to push for massive modernization inspired by foreign systems, railways, education reform, government restructuring. Some support the fast change, others fear the chaos. Then, suddenly, the reforms fail. Cixi intervenes decisively. The emperor is effectively imprisoned inside the palace, while reform leaders face execution or exile. Scholars still debate. Did Cixi truly believe the reforms were a threat to stability, or was she just terrified of losing her personal power? Like many rulers, her intent was likely a mix of self-defense and genuine belief, impossible to fully separate. Picture the palace atmosphere in those tense days. Soft rain tapping on the tiled roofs, terrified officials burning sensitive documents by candlelight, guards shifting positions in silence at midnight, while whispers spread faster than official orders. And somewhere behind those silk curtains, Cixi was deciding the future direction of an empire. A bizarre historical detail about her personal image feels almost unreal next to the political chaos. They say Cixi loved luxury, elaborate robes, rare pearls, jade carvings, and meals with dozens of dishes. Foreign critics later exaggerated these habits, painting her as a villain lost in luxury while China collapsed outside. The reality is way more complicated. Still, it's impossible to ignore the gap between royal luxury and national suffering. Then, the Boxer Rebellion exploded. Anti-foreign violence broke out around 1900 as nationalist groups attacked missionaries and foreign interests. At first, Cixi hesitated. Then, she backed the Boxers against the foreign powers. The result was devastating. An international alliance invaded Beijing. The royal court fled the Forbidden City altogether. Imagine Cixi running west in disguise, through dust-filled roads, in a crowd of soldiers, servants, and terrified officials. While smoke rises from the capital behind her, the center of royal power, once thought to be untouchable, suddenly feels vulnerable for the first time. And maybe that moment haunted her later. Eventually, Cixi returns to Beijing and supports limited reforms in her final years. Railways expand, education changes start, carefully, but the Qing dynasty is already too weak to fix. When she died in 1908, the empire was exhausted, under pressure from inside and out. Just a few years later, the Qing dynasty collapsed completely, and history immediately started debating her. Mastermind, survivor, destroyer, protector. You're leaving the Forbidden City now under the falling snow, while distant lanterns cast a soft glow in the winter mist. But Rome is waiting ahead, with even more heat and noise, where an empress turns scandals into political theatre. And her nights are just beginning. Even in the deep darkness of the night, footsteps echo through narrow stone streets. The warm light of tavern torches spills into crowded alleys, smelling of wine, smoke, olive oil, and dust soaked by rain. Long after sunset, merchants still argue near market stalls. Musicians keep playing in distant courtyards, and senators, wrapped in expensive cloaks, hurry through the dark, accompanied by terrified servants holding oil lamps. And above this restless city sits the imperial palace, glowing dimly against the black Roman sky, like a place where a smart decision has never been made. Inside, Valeria Messalina is waiting, the wife of Emperor Claudius, the mother of imperial heirs, and according to Roman historians, one of the most controversial women in ancient history. Now, Roman historians are definitely not calm and balanced when discussing powerful women. Their writing often feels like tired gossip columnists on too much caffeine. So, whenever they describe an empress as pure evil, you have to be a little careful. Yet, even after filtering out the exaggeration, Messalina's reputation remains shocking. You're walking through the imperial palace now, where marble hallways stretch under painted ceilings decorated with gods, battles, and golden vines. Slaves carrying bronze platters move quietly past fountains in open courtyards, while guards in bright armor stand frozen by massive doors. Everything shines beautifully, which, somehow, makes the corruption hidden beneath it feel even more terrifying. A major historical fact is clear. Messalina married Emperor Claudius at a very young age, around 38 AD. Claudius shocked almost everyone by becoming emperor after the murder of Caligula, another Roman ruler who famously loved terrifying everyone around him. At first glance, Claudius seems like an unlikely emperor. Ancient writers described him as physically awkward and often underestimated by political rivals. But in Roman politics, underestimating people usually ends badly. Messalina understands this quickly, and she learns how much influence exists beside the throne. Roman imperial courts operate like enormous survival games hidden beneath luxury. Senators scheme constantly. Noble families compete for status. Assassinations drift through the city almost as casually as weather reports. One quirky detail from Roman elite culture feels bizarrely modern. Wealthy Romans reportedly attend elaborate dinner parties lasting hours, while servants refill wine continuously and entertainers perform between courses. Imagine discussing treason. While someone nearby plays flute music beside decorative peacocks, civilization evolves technologically, but social absurdity remains eternal. Messalina soon becomes infamous throughout Rome for alleged manipulation, affairs, political intrigue, and ruthless behavior toward rivals. Ancient sources accuse her of engineering executions against nobles who threaten her position or reject her advances. And because nearly all surviving accounts come from male Roman writers hostile toward imperial women, historians spend centuries debating exactly how much is true. Scholars still argue whether Messalina genuinely behaves with extraordinary recklessness, or whether later historians deliberately transform her into a symbol of female corruption, just to entertain readers and criticize the imperial court itself? Possibly both. Because Roman politics already function like organized paranoia wearing expensive jewelry. You move now through crowded banquet halls, glowing with candlelight reflected against silver goblets and polished marble floors. Senators recline on cushioned couches, eating figs, oysters, roasted birds, and honey cakes, while conversations drift dangerously between gossip and conspiracy. At the center of the room sits Messalina herself, young, elegant, watching everything. According to a popular story, she secretly participated in competitions with Rome's most famous prostitutes. Modern historians are deeply skeptical, believing this was a massive exaggeration by Roman writers who loved to shock their readers. Yet, the rumor stuck because Messalina's reputation eventually grew much larger than the woman herself. At some point, notoriety turns into myth, and myths become impossible to separate from reality. Accusations of political manipulation seem far more credible. Ancient accounts describe Messalina targeting wealthy nobles through fabricated charges, seizing property, and using imperial influence to eliminate perceived threats. In Rome, a mere accusation could destroy a life. You're entering the quiet corners of the palace now, where servants whisper behind curtains while scribes copy legal decrees under flickering oil lamps. Somewhere nearby, chains clink softly as prisoners wait for judgments that have likely already been made. Fear spreads with great elegance in imperial systems. A key historical fact accepted by historians is that the root of Messalina's downfall was ultimately her relationship with the Roman senator, Gaius Silius. And this is where the story starts to sound unbelievable. According to ancient historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Messalina entered into a public marriage ceremony with Silius, while still legally married to Emperor Claudius. This was either extreme recklessness, a political coup attempt, or one of the most exaggerated scandals ever invented by ancient writers. Imagine modern newspapers trying to make sense of this. Even Rome stopped for a moment. Scholars still debate whether the ceremony actually happened as described, or if later writers blew it out of proportion to build the scandal. But regardless of the exact details, something serious clearly terrified those closest to Claudius, because panic spread fast through the palace. Picture the atmosphere in those tense hours. Midnight hallways, the sound of rushing footsteps, servants avoiding each other's eyes. Advisors talked in rushed, hushed tones behind closed doors, while the emperor received conflicting reports of the betrayal happening in his own home. It is said that Narcissus, Claudius's powerful freed slave, took decisive action, convincing the emperor that Messalina and Silius were a real threat. And once Roman emperors feel threatened, your chances of survival drop dramatically. A bizarre detail of Roman palace life shows just how strange royal routines could get. Some wealthy Romans reportedly had lavish private gardens filled with exotic animals, fountains, and plants imported from across the empire. Imagine your decorative flamingos wandering nearby eating figs while you discuss executions. Humanity absolutely refuses to separate luxury from chaos. After the conspiracy fails, Messalina finally flees to the gardens of Lucullus, Ancient accounts describe desperation spreading among her remaining supporters as the imperial guards close in. The end comes quickly. A widely accepted historical fact is that Messalina dies in 48 AD after the imperial forces move against her. Ancient sources claim she hesitates to take her own life, forcing a soldier to complete the execution instead. And just like that, one of Rome's most notorious women vanishes. Yet afterward, her reputation grows even larger. Roman writers present Messalina as the ultimate symbol of excess, lust, corruption, and dangerous female ambition. Plays, paintings, and later stories exaggerate her image so much that the real historical woman almost disappears beneath layers of scandal. This might be history's most bizarre fate. Not death, transformation into a legend. You're walking through the quiet imperial palace now. After her fall, torches burn low. Servants remove decorations from empty rooms. Somewhere outside, Rome roars through the night, completely indifferent to personal tragedies. Empires rarely stand still for long. Soon, another queen will emerge in colder lands, where an obsession with royal blood turns entire dynasties into fear and cruelty. And as you dive deeper into these stories, one truth becomes unavoidable. Power doesn't just expose people. Sometimes, it completely transforms them. The palace smells of faint wax, wet stone, and sickness. Outside, winter rain beats against thin windows, while black banners flap violently in the wind atop cold grey towers. Inside royal rooms, servants move quietly with steaming buckets of water, herbal medicines, and heavy blankets embroidered with the faded golden marks of a dynasty. Because here, blood matters more than anything. Royal blood, pure blood, old blood. Kind noble families obsess over it, until entire kingdoms begin to collapse under the weight of their own fear. You're stepping carefully now into the courts of Europe's most tangled dynasties, where marriages happen less for love, and more because rulers think keeping power in the family somehow sounds like great long-term planning. Historians later examine portraits of these royal families, and quietly realize that half the kings on the continent share the exact same tired jawline. Humanity really looked at genetics and decided to freestyle the concept for a few centuries. But tonight, one queen rises above the rest in both fear and obsession. Juana of Castile, better known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, and whether she is truly unstable, politically manipulated, or simply consumed by grief, remains one of history's most haunting debates. You're walking through late 15th century Spain now, where Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile have united fighting kingdoms under strict Catholic rule. Their court shines with military victories, religious power, and royal ambitions. Columbus sailed west under their protection. While the Spanish Inquisition spread terror across the land, churches rose proudly while dungeons quietly filled beneath them. A major historical fact shapes Juana's world instantly. She is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the two most powerful rulers in Europe. From birth, a circle of expectations surrounded her. Political alliances, dynastic marriages, religious obedience. Royal children do not belong to themselves, they belong to the state. Eventually, Juana is married to Philip the Handsome of the Habsburg dynasty, a man reportedly attractive, ambitious, and deeply unfaithful. Their marriage strengthens Spain's ties with powerful European territories exactly as intended. But, emotionally, this marriage becomes a disaster. Ancient palaces always seem to be built specifically for misery. Long hallways, echoing cathedrals, drafty bedrooms so massive that you feel entirely alone, even in a crowd. Now, imagine Juana, walking through Flemish courts beneath massive curtains, while snow falls slowly outside cathedral windows. Nobles bow politely, while gossip spreads invisibly through every room. At first, records describe her as intelligent and capable. Then, slowly, the stories turn dark. Jealousy destroys her marriage. Philip openly keeps mistresses, repeatedly humiliating Juana before the entire court. According to many historians, she reacts intensely, sometimes refusing food, crying uncontrollably, or emotionally exploding during confrontations. And honestly, when you're trapped in a political marriage and your husband publicly shames you across Europe, maintaining emotional stability might be a little difficult. Yet, the rumors spread fast, because royal courts waste no time declaring women mentally unstable whenever it becomes politically convenient. Scholars still debate fiercely today. Did Juana truly suffer from severe mental illness? Or did her father Ferdinand, and later others, deliberately exaggerate her condition just to justify removing her from power? Evidence exists for both emotional instability and political manipulation. The truth remains deeply tangled. A bizarre detail of life in the Spanish court shows just how formal everything becomes. Nobles reportedly wear multiple thick layers of black clothing during mourning rituals that last for months, or even years. Imagine being wrapped in heavy black velvet during the blistering summer heat, because the elite believe that grief should also be used as endurance training. Then, suddenly, tragedy strikes. Philip dies unexpectedly in 1506, at only 28 years old, possibly from sickness, possibly from typhoid, or, according to later rumors, possibly from poison, because in European royal courts, a single natural death immediately triggers conspiracy theories. And after this, Juana breaks down emotionally. This is where history gets incredibly bizarre. According to famous accounts, Juana refuses to separate from Philip's coffin for a very long time. Some stories claim she travels across Spain with the coffin at night, occasionally opening it to look at his body, and forbidding other women from getting too close to him. Historians debate how accurate these stories really are, because writers often exaggerate events. Yet, even cautious scholars agree that after Philip's death, Juana goes through deep grief and unstable behavior. Picture that procession: torches glowing on dark rural roads, monks slowly chanting near the heavy coffin carried under black banners, cold rain soaking the horses and travelers, while villagers watch silently from distant doorways. And somewhere in the middle of that mourning caravan walks a queen, unable or unwilling to let the dead go. The atmosphere feels almost unreal, as if grief is slowly transforming into a Gothic legend. A major historical fact is undisputed. After Philip's death, Juana lost her political independence for the rest of her life. Her father Ferdinand took control as ruler, claiming her mental instability made it impossible for her to rule. Later, her own son Charles kept her imprisoned as well. She spent decades in isolation, inside the royal palace fortress of Tordesillas. You're walking through dim stone corridors now, where guards stand outside locked rooms and candlelight fades against cold walls. The Queen of Castile lives not like a ruler, but almost like a prisoner, surrounded by attendants who watch her constantly. Outside, Spain is rising as a global empire. Conquistadors are crossing oceans. Gold is filling European markets. Wars are reshaping continents. Meanwhile, Juana remained trapped in those exact same rooms year after year. A bizarre historical detail about her imprisonment feels especially heartbreaking. Some reports claim that during deep depression, she neglected bathing, eating, and personal care, refusing to see visitors for long periods. Whether every detail is accurate or exaggerated, it is clear that isolation defined most of her later life. Scholars still debate. Did decades of imprisonment destroy her mental state completely? Imagine being politically silenced for decades, while almost everyone around you treats your emotions as proof. that you deserve to be caged. Powerful men often fear unstable rulers, but they fear legitimate rulers they cannot completely control. Even more, and unfortunately, Juana becomes both. You're standing now near a narrow window, looking out over the rainy Spanish fields, stretching into forever beyond Tordesillas. Somewhere below, church bells ring softly in the evening mist, while servants whisper in hushed tones in nearby hallways. Within these chambers sits a woman history remembers all at once as a queen, a prisoner, a grieving widow, a political obstacle, and a symbol of madness. Perhaps none of these identities alone truly define her. And that is what's so disturbing about history's so-called evil queens. Many are ruthless. Some are misunderstood. Most are simply caught in brutal systems created long before they arrived. And yet, an even more terrifying vengeance is waiting ahead. Because, beyond Spain, another queen turns her grief into a weapon, transforming personal loss into decades of bloodshed across medieval kingdoms. Her name is Brunhilda, and there is no mercy left. The forests of early medieval Europe are thick with heavy fog, while crows circle over damp battlefields scattered with broken shields and abandoned spears. Cold rivers flow through dark valleys, where wooden villages sit clueless along muddy roads, and every distant sound of hooves carries the threat of war. Because in the fractured kingdoms of the Franks, peace is just a short pause between betrayals. You're entering the brutal world of the 6th century now, where kings divide territories like family inheritances, and queens build influence through marriage, alliances, revenge, and a survival instinct sharp enough to match any warrior's sword. And few queens embody absolute vengeance more completely than Brunhilda. History remembers her as intelligent, ambitious, ruthless, and terrifyingly determined. For decades, she becomes the center of endless cycles of murders, political warfare, and dynastic hatred, stretching across multiple kingdoms. And, honestly, early medieval Europe feels less like an organized civilization and more like a bunch of armed families who are openly rejecting medical science. The story begins in Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom, where Brunhilda was born into royalty around 543 AD. She grew up amid court politics, Christian faith, military alliances, and the constant understanding that royal daughters eventually become diplomatic tools. A major historical fact shaped her destiny instantly. Brunhilda was married to King Sigebert I of Austrasia as part of a political alliance between the Franks and the Visigoths. At first, by medieval standards, this marriage seemed exceptionally successful. Contemporary sources suggest that Sigebert genuinely respected Brunhilda's intelligence and advice. Together, they strengthened the administration and royal power, which, naturally, created enemies instantly. Because in unstable kingdoms, powerful couples trigger massive suspicion and paranoia. You're walking now through royal palaces made of wood, lit by smoky torches. Warriors shout and feast at long wooden tables near roasted meat, black bread, and overflowing cups of beer. Hunting dogs sleep beneath the benches, and iron weapons hang on rough stone walls. Outside, rain pours heavily over the fortress, while messengers arrive gasping from distant borders. This is not the grand royalty of the Renaissance. This is the politics of survival, wrapped in fur cloaks. And, nearby, another queen is waiting, just as determined to dominate her world. Fredegund. From a servant to a queen, a skilled manipulator, a terrifying nightmare to everyone around her. The rivalry between Brunhilda and Fredegund becomes one of the most brutal political feuds in medieval Europe. Historians describe decades of murder, betrayal, war, and revenge, tying these two women together through generations of bloodshed. And like many historical rivalries, it begins partly with marriage politics that turn destructively personal. Sigebert's brother Chilperic, ruler of neighbouring Neustria, first married Brunhilda's sister, Galswintha, but Chilperic remained obsessed with his former servant, Fredegund. Eventually, Galswintha was murdered, possibly strangled in her bed. Shortly after, Chilperic married Fredegund. You can almost hear the echo of medieval shock across Europe. Scholars still debate whether Fredegund directly ordered Galswintha's murder, or if later historians exaggerated her role because powerful women are easy to villainize. Yet, suspicion spread instantly, and Brunhilda never forgives this. You're moving now through rain-soaked camps, where soldiers sharpen axes near muddy fires, while mounted messengers gallop past with declarations of war and revenge between kingdoms. Noble families carefully choose sides as alliances constantly shift. Violence escalates rapidly. Open conflict breaks out between Sigebert and Chilperic. Murders multiply. Armies clash repeatedly across the Frankish territories. Then, just as Sigebert closes in on total victory, he is assassinated by hired killers in 575 AD. Many blame Fredegund for the strike. Brunhilda's life changes in a single breath. Throughout history, grief repeatedly turns royal women into something far harder. A quirky detail of Frankish royal culture shows just how physically brutal elite life is. Despite noble status, kings and queens travel massive distances through forests, storms, and dangerous roads. Because stable central capitals barely exist, imagine ruling kingdoms while constantly riding through freezing mud, wrapped in wet fur cloaks. The medieval system truly offered equal opportunity misery for everyone. After Sigebert's murder, Brunhilda faces imprisonment, political humiliation, and constant threats from rival factions. Yet, somehow, she survives time and time again. Perhaps that is her most extraordinary talent, endurance. Over time, she rebuilds her influence through alliances, strategic marriages, and regencies for young rulers. She governs territories, negotiates political deals, strengthens infrastructure, and pushes administrative reforms. But the desire for vengeance never truly leaves the background. The feud between Brunhilda and Fredegund spreads like an inherited poison across generations. Children become rivals. Grandchildren inherit wars. The cycle of assassinations drags on for decades. A major historical fact is clear. Brunhilda wields extraordinary political power for a woman of her era, ruling as regent and power broker over large parts of the Frankish kingdoms for many years. And many nobles hate her precisely for that reason. Partly because she aggressively centralizes royal power, partly because the aristocracy generally resents powerful rulers, and partly because medieval historians often portray politically active women as an unnatural threat to the proper order. You're entering Brunhilda's later years now, where ancient castles look over winter barren forests, inside smoky rooms. Advisors argue near maps laid out on rough wooden tables, while armored servants wait impatiently nearby. Kingdoms remain unstable. Young rulers are dying unexpectedly. The aristocracy is constantly breaking alliances. And Brunhilda, now old but still politically active, continues to develop her strategy amid the chaos. Scholars still debate whether later historians painted her as overly monstrous because victorious enemies controlled most of the surviving records. Some sources accuse her of plotting ruthless murders. Others acknowledge her true administrative skill and determination. Like many personalities of tonight, she remains trapped between reality and propaganda. Yet, the end comes with terrifying cruelty. Eventually, Brunhilda loses the support of major nobles who ally against her with King Clotaire II, Fredegund's son, and medieval vengeance, once fully unleashed, rarely stops gracefully. Brunhilda is captured in 613 AD, at nearly 80 years old. What happens next becomes infamous. According to historians, She is publicly blamed for multiple murders and atrocities, and then executed in a horrific manner. Some accounts claim she is tortured for days, and finally tied to wild horses that tear her apart. Historians debate the exact details, because medieval writers loved dramatic endings filled with symbolism and bloodshed, yet there is no doubt that her death was violent and intentionally humiliating. Picture that final scene under a dim sky and cold wind, an old queen standing before armed enemies, mud beneath worn shoes, warriors watching silently. A life filled with ambition, grief, revenge, and survival, shrinking into one terrifying moment. And somewhere far away, crows are flying again over the battlefield. A quirky detail of medieval execution practices sounds strangely theatrical. Public punishments often included symbolic humiliation, meant to send a political message far beyond just death. Medieval rulers never missed an opportunity for dramatic effect. After Brunhilda's fall, historians instantly turned her into a cautionary tale about female ambition, revenge, and political chaos. Yet she leaves behind roads, churches, fortifications, and decades of rule that deeply shaped the Frankish kingdoms. The contradiction remains: the creator and the destroyer, the victim and the attacker, the monster and the survivor. You're leaving the Frankish lands now amid heavy storm clouds, while the bells of distant monasteries echo across the damp hills. An even deeper superstition is waiting ahead, because in Castile, whispers of witchcraft and torture echo through royal hallways, where fear becomes the ultimate political weapon, and the next queen knows exactly how to use it. Candles burn low in the monastery hallways, while thunder echoes over the distant hills of Castile. Outside, rainwater drips continuously from broken stone drains, and somewhere deep within the fortress, a heavy iron door slowly shuts, like the beginning of something terrible. You're walking carefully now through late medieval Spain, where religion, superstition, and royal power are so deeply tied together that separating them is almost impossible. Crosses hang over doorways, priests pray through sickness and storms, common villagers keep amulets to protect themselves from curses, while nobles secretly consult astrologers. Despite publicly condemning such practices, fear is everywhere, and fear becomes especially useful when rulers learn how to control it. Tonight, the whispers are about the woman later remembered in folklore as the Witch Queen of Castile, though, like many terrifying legends, the truth is tangled between real cruelty and exaggerated rumors. Her historical shadow combines elements of several noble women and rulers accused across generations of witchcraft, deception, poisoning, and political terror. But the atmosphere surrounding these queens remains incredibly haunting today. You're stepping now into an era in royal Castile, where a mere accusation could completely destroy a life. Stone fortresses stand over windswept plains, while crowded cities are trapped behind thick protective walls. Church bells echo continuously down narrow streets filled with blacksmiths, mule carts, wandering monks, and suspicious citizens, all trying to avoid drawing attention from both nobles and inquisitors. A major historical fact completely dominates this era. The Spanish Inquisition expands royal and religious power through questioning, imprisonment, and punishment of suspected heretics. Although often exaggerated in modern imagination, this institution spreads immense fear across Spain, and within terrified societies, rulers soon find that accusations are often more powerful than armies. You're walking now through torch-lit royal chambers, where tapestries show saints crushing demons beneath jewel-encrusted feet, while advisors whisper near long oak tables covered in parchment decrees. Outside, cold wind rattles the stained glass windows. The queen listens silently, watching, measuring, waiting. Stories connected to the Witch Queen describe secret chambers hidden beneath palaces where prisoners disappeared into the night. Some accounts speak of poison rings, cursed relics, and astrologers called secretly after midnight. Others accuse royal officials of running fake witchcraft trials against political enemies. Scholars still debate how many of these stories came from real events and how many grew through folklore shaped by fear and propaganda. Medieval societies often blamed powerful women for mysterious deaths, crop failures, or political disasters, because humans absolutely love transforming anxiety into a story. Yet, the torture chambers definitely existed. That part is not a legend. A quirky detail of late medieval Spain sounds strangely normal against all this darkness. Wealthy nobles sometimes carried scented oranges or pomanders filled with cloves and herbs. Because crowded cities in the summer carried an unbearable smell, imagine investigating witchcraft plots while sniffing cinnamon fruits just to survive the environment. History truly refuses to be simple. Now, you're descending beneath the palace, into damp stone corridors lit by smoky torches. Iron rings are fixed into the walls. Wooden buckets sit next to straw beds. Somewhere in the darkness, water drips slowly. In this era, questioning relied heavily on confessions, and confession becomes dangerously flexible the moment pain enters the room. A historical fact is undisputed. Across Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods, accusations of witchcraft rapidly targeted weak individuals, especially women. Fear spread equally through villages and royal courts. Misfortune demanded an explanation. Crops failed. Children died unexpectedly. Storms destroyed harvests. Someone had to be blamed. And rulers often feed that fear, because a terrified public is easier to control. Picture the crowded public squares now, where accused prisoners stand under a grey sky. Priests hold their cloaks tightly against the cold wind, shouting words of condemnation before an anxious crowd. Smoke rises from nearby chimneys. Merchants pause their business just to watch. Life goes on alongside the terror, as if the two are naturally tied together. The Queen's reputation grows even darker, through whispered stories told by servants and travelling monks. Some claim she studies forbidden books bound in black leather. Others insist that crows gather near her chambers before an execution. One rumour even says that noble women were forced to take loyalty oaths tied to blood rituals beneath candlelit cathedrals. Almost certainly an exaggeration, perhaps. But fear doesn't need proof to survive. A major historical fact shaping that era is that noble courts constantly used spies disguised as servants, priests, or clerks. Political enemies quietly disappeared after private accusations. Poisonings remained a constant, terrifying concern. Constant secret letters drifted between rival factions. Therefore, in systems already drowning in suspicion, even obviously false rumors started to sound believable. You're walking now inside cathedrals, lit by hundreds of candles, beneath painted ceilings and clouds of incense smoke. The voices of choirs echo slowly through stone arches, while kneeling worshippers pray for protection against sin, plague, famine, war, and invisible evil. Medieval humans lived in a universe crowded with spiritual dangers. Demons felt real. Curses seemed possible. Divine punishment felt instant. And rulers capable of exploiting these fears wielded extraordinary power. Scholars still debate today whether stories of the Witch Queen reflect misogynistic anxieties about female political power rather than actual occult practices. Powerful queens are constantly linked to poison, witchcraft, seductive influence, or supernatural forces, because societies uncomfortable with female rule constantly look for supernatural explanations. A capable male ruler is called powerful. A capable female ruler is sometimes assumed to be witch-like. Humanity truly deserves a few centuries of suspicion. Yet, not every accusation against these courts turns out to be fiction. torture, imprisonment, forced confessions, and political assassinations definitely happen. Religious fear truly destroys lives. You're entering a secret royal study now, filled with astrological charts, brass instruments, prayer books, and sealed letters tied in red ribbons. Raindrops beat against narrow windows, while the Queen quietly consults a masked advisor near flickering candles. The atmosphere is so heavy, it feels suffocating. A quirky detail of court superstition shows just how deeply magical thinking was mixed into elite politics. Some rulers consulted physicians who prescribed crushed gemstones, mercury mixtures, or animal organs as medicine. Imagine recovering from medieval stress, and your doctor hands you a soup made of crushed emeralds. Science truly crawls through history, carrying injured dignity along with it. As the years pass, the legend of the Witch Queen spreads far beyond reality. Servants swear they hear screams beneath the palace after midnight. Villagers avoid the nearby forests. Travelers make protective signs when passing royal banners on the roads. And eventually, the line between the ruler and the myth completely vanishes. This transformation is perhaps fear's most powerful weapon, because once people assume someone is capable of anything, resistance weakens before the action even begins. You're moving now toward the Queen's final years. Silence settles over the palace. Old priests whisper in corners. Young nobles avoid eye contact during court ceremonies. Outside, winter's heavy shadow falls over the Spanish countryside, while rumors continue to travel farther than armies. Then death arrives, as it always does. Quietly, inevitably, and the stories that follow become even more terrifying. History describes the permanent sealing of cursed chambers after the Queen's passing. Local legends claim shadows wander the abandoned hallways where prisoners once vanished. Some villagers insist that crows still circle the ruined towers during storms. Perhaps nonsense, but wonderfully mysterious nonsense. You're leaving Castile now in the cold moonlight, while monastery bells echo across rain-soaked valleys. However, something even stranger is waiting ahead. Because scattered across forgotten kingdoms and hidden courts our Queen's history barely remembers, and tonight, some of them might just be the most ruthless of all. Historical maps often leave things out. They paint kings, borders, famous battles, and glorious empires in neat, clean colors. But beyond those polished records lie small kingdoms, forgotten courts, isolated fortresses, and rulers whose cruelty never reaches the big history books because too few survived to write about them. Tonight, you vanish into those exact shadows. Far from the massive palaces of Rome or Beijing, small kingdoms shimmer briefly like torchlight in history's fog. Mountain strongholds, desert forts, island courts surrounded by stormy black seas. Places where queens rule with absolute power, because no empire cares enough to step in. And sometimes, isolation breeds monsters far quicker than empires do. Your journey begins high in the Caucasus Mountains, where freezing winds scream past stone towers guarding narrow passes between kingdoms. Snow freezes against the fortress walls, while villagers below huddle around fires inside wooden homes. Here, stories still drift about the successors of Queen Tamar and regional noblewomen. Writers claim they blinded rivals during succession struggles, poisoned relatives, and imprisoned entire families inside mountain forts. Historians of that era often exaggerate, yet one truth remains identical across every forgotten court. Power without supervision becomes extremely dangerous. A major historical fact repeated across medieval societies is that succession crises routinely trigger murders, imprisonments, and betrayals within royal families. Brothers kill brothers. Mothers turn against sons. Cousins disappear mysteriously after banquets. And the queens who handle these systems learn very quickly that hesitation invites destruction. Now, you move toward the deserts of Central Asia, where silk caravans cross endless sand dunes under a blistering sun. Fortified cities rise from the sand, surrounded by crowded markets filled with spices, copper lamps, woven rugs, and camel caravans, spreading rumors between empires. In a forgotten khanate, legends live on of a queen regent who reportedly kept political prisoners chained beneath the palace floors, while hosting grand poetry sessions right above them. Guests sip sweet wine and listen to musicians, while somewhere below in the dark, enemies waited. Humanity has a stunning ability to normalize horror when decorative rugs are involved. Scholars still debate how many of these stories reflect reality, and how many are cautionary moral tales created to warn against female power. But even the exaggerated stories highlight the widespread fear surrounding rulers who operate outside traditional boundaries, especially women who rule alone. Now, you're wandering through a stormy island kingdom somewhere along the northern Atlantic coast, where waves crash violently against black rocks under a freezing sky. Fishermen make the sign of the cross when passing ruined watchtowers. Locals claim these towers are haunted by a queen who executed sailors for imaginary betrayals. According to regional folklore, she intentionally put out lighthouse fires during storms, causing foreign ships to crash and destroy themselves against the rocks below. Almost certainly an exaggeration, perhaps. Yet, coastal states throughout history have definitely engaged in piracy, wreckage, and brutal maritime politics. Medieval rulers rarely separated trade from violence. A quirky historical detail from isolated island courts sounds strangely fascinating amid all the murders. Nobles in cold regions often kept trained crows, or seabirds in large palaces for entertainment and weather forecasting. Imagine planning an execution while a massive, judgmental bird is nearby screaming for fish. To be honest, the crow was probably the smartest being in the room. You're moving south now into heavily forested kingdoms, where dense moisture hangs beneath massive trees covered in vines and orchids. Stone temples are slowly crushed beneath roots, while the echo of drums vibrates through foggy valleys as evening falls. Oral traditions here speak of warrior queens executing enemies ceremonially after military victories, displaying rivals' heads along processional roads, or consulting priests before sacrifices meant to ensure crops and safety. A core historical fact often ignored in simplified narratives is that pre-modern justice systems in many cultures used public punishment as a spectacle. Executions weren't hidden away quietly. They were intentionally displayed to reinforce power. Fear works best when it is visible. Picture the crowded ceremonial squares, now under a blistering sun, where nobles decorated in feathers and gold jewelry. Watch prisoners brought before a chanting crowd. Smoke rises from incense stands. Warriors beat rhythmically on shields. Somewhere nearby, children chase each other through the market, because life continues, even amid ritual violence. This paradox is always unsettling. A small Balkan kingdom offers another chilling legend, where a widowed queen is said to have bricked her political enemies alive into the foundations of monasteries. Historians debate whether this story stems from actual events, symbolic folklore, or anti-royal propaganda spread later by rivals. Yet, humans across multiple civilizations repeatedly invent stories of rulers burying enemies inside walls. Which raises the uncomfortable question, why does this image appear so consistently everywhere? You're walking now through monastery archives lit by torches, where exhausted monks copy history onto parchment amid snow falling slowly outside narrow windows. In the cold, ink sometimes freezes. Candle wax drips onto wooden tables. Somewhere in these records, only the debris of forgotten rulers survives. The slaughter of a toxic nephew, a missing ambassador, a queen described simply as greatly feared. History preserves terror unevenly. Some tyrants become immortal legends, Others fade almost completely, leaving behind identical, horrific scars. Scholars still debate how much memory itself depends on politics. Rather than morality, victorious states preserve certain narratives while destroying others. Some queens become villains because their enemies lived long enough to write about them. Some escape justice entirely because no records remain. This realization, this realization, this realization changes how you look at history. You begin to understand just how fragile reputation truly is. A bizarre detail of many medieval courts shows how obsessed rulers became with omens and animals. White stags, eclipses, comets, deformed births, or unusual bird behavior routinely triggered panic. As leaders read natural events as supernatural warnings about legitimacy or betrayal. Imagine ruling a kingdom while being emotionally unstable because of a duck acting suspiciously near the pond. Ancient statecraft truly required an exhausting level of superstition management. You're moving now through abandoned ruins slowly reclaimed by jungles and sand, roofless palaces, crumbling fortresses, empty throne rooms where vines crawl across broken stone floors, wide open to the sky. There was a time when people feared these rulers so much, they whispered their names. Now, the wind blows freely through their palaces. And, perhaps, that is the ultimate paradox of power. No matter how terrifying a queen becomes, silence eventually claims everything. Across every civilization you visited tonight, one major historical truth remains unavoidable. Rulers who govern through fear may gain temporary obedience, but fear rarely creates permanent stability. Terror weakens societies. Suspicion hollows out courts from the inside. Violence requires constant renewal just to maintain control. Eventually, systems built on fear begin to consume themselves, yet humanity never truly learns this lesson. Because somewhere in the modern world, at this exact moment, someone powerful is likely staring at a map, believing that threats are a permanent solution to deep human problems. History sighs deeply. In every century, you're standing now in the ruins of a forgotten throne room. As evening sunlight filters through collapsed arches, falling over cracked mosaics faded by rain and time, no guards are left. No banners wave, no servants whisper in the hallways, only silence and echoes. Yet, behind all these stories, one final question still remains. Why do kings so often breed monsters? Why do palaces create such intense paranoia? Why does power push some rulers toward absolute cruelty, while others manage to resist it? The answers wait quietly, deep inside the psychology of isolation. And the next palace is quieter than all the rest. The palace is now filled with silence. But this is not a peaceful silence. It is the deep, suffocating silence of massive rooms built for hundreds, where barely anyone dares to speak out loud anymore. Footsteps echo too loudly down marble corridors. Candles burn low next to untouched food. Guards stare straight ahead, pretending not to notice the tension slowly dissolving into everything around them. You're wandering through these empty hallways now, while raindrops beat softly against stained glass windows and thunder rolls far beyond the royal gardens. Portraits of dead rulers stare down with harsh expressions, as if they too deeply regret ever touching the crown. And tonight, after traveling through so many royal courts, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The crown changes people, not always instantly, sometimes slowly, quietly, like water, wearing down stone. You begin to recognize the pattern stretching across centuries and continents. Cleopatra, trapped in Roman ambition. Zetian, tangled in endless conspiracies. Mary, consumed by religious certainty. Catherine, surviving a civil war. Ranavalona, isolating an island kingdom through fear. And Cixi, steering a collapsing empire while foreign powers close in from every direction. Different cultures, different religions, Different eras, yet the exact same atmosphere appears time and time again. Isolation, suspicion, pressure, and within that pressure, humanity begins to warp into the strangest shapes. A major historical fact backed by modern research is that throughout history, rulers often suffer from deep social isolation precisely because of their position. Emperors rarely experience normal friendship, servants constantly flatter them, advisors hide uncomfortable truths, and rivals conceal their intentions behind polite etiquette. Eventually, rulers stop knowing who genuinely cares about them. This uncertainty damages people. You're walking now through a massive royal dining room, where silver cups sit untouched beneath dimly lit chandeliers. At the other end of the table, a queen dines entirely alone, while musicians play soft melodies nearby, because protocol demands maintaining elegance, even during emotional chaos. Imagine living like this for decades. Every word is analyzed, every gesture is political, every mistake is remembered forever. The human brain is simply not designed for absolute power, and history demonstrates this constantly in dramatic ways. A quirky detail of royal courts across different civilizations shows just how physically and emotionally isolated emperors become. Some rulers develop elaborate ceremonial barriers just to stop common people from contacting them directly. Servants bow backward when leaving the room. Nobles avoid eye contact. Entire systems are built to separate rulers from ordinary human contact. It sounds like an excellent strategy if your goal is to build emotionally disconnected, paranoid rooms. Scholars still debate whether power itself fundamentally corrupts people, or if positions of power simply attract individuals who are already driven by cruelty and control. Perhaps both forces work together. Ambitious personalities seek power, and then power amplifies their worst tendencies. A deeply unfortunate, vicious cycle. You're moving now through dressing rooms decorated with velvet curtains and golden mirrors reflecting flickering candlelight. Outside the windows, storms gather over dark forests. While inside the palace, servants whisper rumors of poison, betrayal, or rebellion, because fear becomes an addiction. After surviving a few real conspiracies, rulers begin to imagine enemies everywhere. And honestly, sometimes they're right. Perhaps that is the most terrifying aspect of royalty. Suspicion is often completely rational. Roman emperors were assassinated regularly. Medieval kings faced literal betrayal from their closest relatives. Queens dealt with constant plots to remove them from power. The threat is so real that paranoia starts to sound like common sense. But rational doubt slowly hardens into an obsession. A major historical fact repeated throughout royal history is that the uncertainty of succession makes courts deeply unstable. Until an heir is clear, political factions multiply instantly. Nobles bet on future rulers. Advisors manipulate royal children like pawns, and rival claimants quietly gather supporters. Families stop acting like families. They become battlefields. Imagine a royal nursery now, where children play with attendants who are already calculating future alliances around them. A prince builds with wooden blocks, while nearby adults discuss which cousin might eventually poison him. Humanity has truly perfected anxiety over generations. And within these systems, queens face uniquely brutal expectations. They must produce heirs, maintain alliances, appear elegant, stay politically useful, and look neither too weak nor too powerful. A single misstep destroys a reputation in a second. If a queen remains passive, critics call her foolish. If she takes decisive action, critics call her dangerous. History offers an incredibly narrow path for powerful women just to survive. Scholars still debate how deeply misogyny shapes the reputation of so-called evil queens. Many male rulers commit identical, or far worse atrocities, yet they are remembered as powerful, strategic, or great. On the other hand, ambitious queens are labeled as witches, temptresses, monsters, or madwomen. This double standard has echoed across centuries. Yet, acknowledging the unfairness doesn't erase the actual cruelty. Tonight, behind the luxury of these palaces, some queens are truly overseeing executions, torture, massacres, or political terror. Power presses down on people, but individuals still make choices within those pressures. This uncomfortable balance is what matters. You're walking now through a royal chapel where candles flicker beneath painted saints, and a queen kneels entirely alone in prayer. Her crown sits nearby on a velvet cushion encrusted with gold and gems. From a distance, royalty looks magnificent. Up close, it often feels like a beautifully decorated cage. A quirky detail of many historical courts shows how rulers mentally try to escape this constant pressure. Some become obsessed with astrology. Others collect exotic animals, rare gems, mechanical clocks, or bizarre relics. Some bury themselves in religion or alchemy. When your life lacks a normal foundation, strange obsessions take over just to fill the emptiness. Imagine controlling armies, yet spending hours consulting someone who claims the planet Mars is angry with your marriage plans. Civilization evolves at an agonizingly slow pace. You're wandering now through abandoned parts of the palace, where dust settles over unused furniture and faded curtains. Beyond the walls, ordinary people are farming fields, raising children, baking bread, and arguing with neighbors. Real life, the exact life rulers slowly lose touch with. And, perhaps, this isolation explains far more than simple cruelty. Because when leaders stop seeing people as human beings and begin viewing them only as threats, subjects, statistics, or symbols, making horrific decisions becomes terrifyingly easy. History repeats this lesson time and time again. Humans humbly continue to ignore it. A major historical fact backed by political historians is that unchecked power consistently increases the potential for abuse, regardless of culture or era. Courts without accountability slide into corruption almost automatically. Fear silences criticism, loyalty replaces merit, and information is distorted long before it ever reaches the ruler. Eventually, leaders live in artificial realities made entirely of filtered truths. And filtered truths give birth to disasters. You're standing now on the highest balcony of the palace, looking out over cities sleeping beneath the clouds in the moonlight. Thin streams of smoke rise from chimneys in the cold night, while the faint echo of church bells drifts over the rooftops. Somewhere below, thousands of ordinary people are sleeping, completely unaware of the court conspiracies operating above them. This paradox somehow feels important, because despite all the coronations and ceremonies, history ultimately belongs to the people who live beneath the rulers rather than the rulers themselves. And in the end, every palace empties, every throne gathers dust, every terrifying queen becomes nothing more than a story, whispered by candlelight in the darkness of the night. You turn away from the balcony now, as dawn slowly touches the horizon. Just one final journey left. Back through the ruins, back through the echoes, back toward the ghosts that history can never fully bury. Dawn arrives slowly over the ruins. A pale grey light spreads over broken fortresses, abandoned palaces, and empty throne rooms, where the silence is now far deeper than any queen who ever ruled them. The wind blows gently through cracked arches, while vines climb forgotten walls that were once guarded by soldiers, completely convinced their empire would last forever. History ultimately ends right here. Quiet stone, cold wind, echoes. You're wandering now through the remains of what you saw tonight. Cleopatra's vanished Alexandria, partly swallowed by time and the sea. Elisabeth Báthory's massive fortress, rising over foggy forests. China's grand imperial palaces, where silk curtains once hid deadly whispers, and England's rain-darkened towers, where the smoke of executions rose into grey skies. Every place looks smaller without the people who used to terrorize it, and yet somehow heavier too, because stories leave scars behind. You step carefully into an abandoned banquet hall, where long wooden tables sit beneath roofs collapsed under the morning sky. Rainwater collects in silver cups faded green by time. Somewhere nearby, crows hop across broken mosaic floors, searching for scraps that disappeared centuries ago. Across every civilization you visited tonight, one core historical fact becomes painfully clear. No ruler, no matter how terrifying, escapes death. Empires collapse. Dynasties fail. Names are erased. Even the most horrific queens eventually become subjects for exhausted historians to argue over, and for sleepy internet listeners trying to relax before bed. Humanity has truly transformed collective trauma into nighttime entertainment. Strange species. Yet, memory matters. And these women remain memorable because they touch something ancient within the human imagination. The fear of power. The fear of manipulation. The fear of isolation. The fear of what happens when ordinary human flaws meet extraordinary authority. You're walking now through the rain-soaked palace gardens in the moonlight. Gardens now choked with weeds and tangled roses. Statues lean sideways under layers of moss, while broken fountains collect rainwater, reflecting the pale clouds drifting above. Once, plots were whispered in these gardens behind feathers and silk sleeves. Now, only insects live here. This transformation feels strangely comforting. Scholars still debate endlessly about the queens you met tonight. Was Cleopatra truly devious, or just politically brilliant? Was Zetian unfairly villainized by male historians? Did Catherine de' Medici deliberately order a massacre, or did she simply lose control of a France already burning with violence? Was Joanna mad, unjustly imprisoned? Or both? History rarely gives clean answers. Instead, it leaves behind fragments, letters, rumors, accounts written by biased survivors. And somewhere within those broken pieces, humans attempt to rebuild entire lives. A quirky historical detail survives from several abandoned castles across Europe. Local villagers often refuse to enter certain ruins after dark, believing spirits wander there, especially the ghosts of rulers connected to cruelty or betrayal. Rationally, old buildings just make strange noises in the wind, but emotionally, humans hear one creak of a floorboard at midnight and instantly conclude that ghosts have returned to finish unfinished business. To be honest, it makes sense. Now, you move toward the sea, where ruined fortresses look down at black water, crashing against the rocks below. The salty wind carries the distant screams of seabirds past empty watchtowers, while faded royal banners rot quietly in forgotten storerooms. Somewhere, a queen once stood, feared by thousands. Now, the waves are patiently erasing her footprints. Perhaps that is history's greatest equalizer. Time eventually humiliates everyone. These terrifying queens of tonight controlled armies, prisons, courts, executions, religions, marriages, and nations for years. Yet, in the end, most lose control over even their own stories. Enemies rewrite reputations. Supporters vanish. Legends grow even stranger. With every passing generation, power fades, narratives survive, and narratives keep transforming. Dawn arrives slowly now over a ruined chapel, where fragments of candles lie near broken altars covered in dust. Morning sunlight filters through fractured stained glass, scattering dim colors across the stone floor. For a moment, everything feels quiet. No conspiracies, no executions, no whispers behind the curtains. Just peace. Perhaps this peace is the deepest desire of many rulers. a peace they never managed to achieve while alive. A major historical truth backed by modern psychology is that prolonged isolation and absolute power gradually warp perception. Leaders surrounded only by loyalty and fear lose their connection to ordinary reality over time. Decisions turn cold, empathy fades, and suspicion grows. And there are always enough terrified people in palaces to tell rulers exactly what they want to hear. You picture these queens in the loneliness of their final nights. Cleopatra, listening to the sound of the Nile outside dark windows. Mary, praying desperately by candlelight while England slips through her fingers. Ranavalona, hearing the distant echo of drums in Madagascar after decades of fear. Cixi, sitting quietly behind silk curtains, watching her empire break beyond repair. And Brunhilda, staring out at mud-splattered battlefields, knowing that vengeance has destroyed everything around her. In those moments, they weren't monsters, they were just old humans, trapped in the consequences of their own choices. This realization makes history strangely gentle, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. A quirky detail of ancient royal burial traditions sounds strangely tender amid so much violence. Many rulers are buried with deeply personal items meant to offer comfort even after death. Jewelry, religious amulets, weapons, letters, small symbols of identity carried into the dark because humans desperately crave continuity, even after everything else vanishes. Civilization shifts constantly. Fear changes very little. You're leaving the final ruins now, as evening begins to return once more over forests, rivers, deserts, and forgotten roads. Torches flicker faintly in distant villages, while cold stars slowly emerge above. Somewhere, people still whisper the names of these queens, not because they are entirely evil, but because they expose uncomfortable truths about power and human nature. The capacity for cruelty exists almost everywhere. So does resilience. So does grief. So does loneliness. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of tonight is the realization that history's monsters often begin their journeys as ordinary humans, people navigating impossible worlds until ambition, trauma, fear, or the struggle for survival gradually shapes them into something far harder. The wind blows slowly now through the deep trees. The fortress windows slowly fade into shadows. And finally, the stories fall silent. Good night.